All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the second session of Pirkei Avot, Wisdom on the Road to Sinai. Last week we looked at kind of an overarching theory of Pirkei Avot, especially focusing on the term Avot, which most literally means fathers or ancestors and the like. But also we saw how Av can also mean a basic principle or a paradigm. And we kind of saw that Pirkei Avot is trying to teach a mode of wisdom which helps us navigate between what I call principle and person, namely the kind of the theory and the practice. How are we able to take these ideas of wisdom and apply them in real life? So that's going to be a through line as we're going to continue learning. And the latest example of, let's say, a pattern, actually this is a fun word, especially in honor of the mothers in the class. Who knows what the word is in Latin for pattern? Matrix, right? Like the Matrix, right? Like the pattern that's under the universe, you know, in the cool movie with the kung fu and stuff. But matrix or matrix comes from the word mater, which means mother. So just like there's the avot, we can also think of like the imahot, the patterns as well. So we're going to see that we're going to have two teachings that claim to provide the three basic foundational principles of the world. Right? We have two different early rabbis, and they're both going to give us their theories of what are the three essential features, or even maybe purposes, of the world. And we're going to see, do these contradict? Are they just kind of neutrally next to each other, or are they in some way symbiotically working together? It's all a bit up in the air. Let's bring ourselves a little back to ground, and let's look at the texts together. Here, I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay, here we go. So it's called On These Three Things, the Foundations of the World. Dum dum dum. So here we go. So the second Mishnah of Pirkei Avos quotes a teaching from Shimon HaTzadik, Simeon the Righteous, Simeon the Just, who was an early rabbi, one of the last of the rabbis who were there in the time of the temple. So he says, Shimon HaTzadik hayam mishiarei Knesset HaGadola. He was indeed one of the last of the sages from the men of the Great Assembly, which we referred to before, which is kind of like a proto-Sanhedrin, a legal body. He would say, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omeid. The world stands on three things. Al haTorah, v'al ha'avodah. Al ha'avodah, v'al Gemilut Hasadim. Right? On Torah, on service, worship, service, work, labor, but referring to sacred work, right? Avodah is a shorthand for the temple service, but we're going to see the Mishnah is going to play with that a little bit. So Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Hasadim, right? Acts of loving kindness or acts of kindness. Translations here says piety. I don't think that's actually an apt translation. We're going to see how it pushes us. I mean, piety is interesting. We're going to hold that in the back of your mind, because it's going to play with it a little bit. So Shimon HaTzadik says the world stands on three things: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. All right. So if you were just to kind of summarize, or what are your reflections or reactions to that triad?
There's a song using there's a Hasidic song that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very famous teaching. There's a number of different musical settings for it. Why these three things, do you think? Why are these the three things he highlights?
I would say it's three of the basics. Torah means you're learning and you're following halacha. Avodah means service to Hashem, so you're devoted to Hashem. And Gemilut Chasadim is basically why we have all of it. It's to be a mensch.
Okay, so there's three different aspects here. There's like there's the intellectual aspect of Torah, and there's
Right.
the Avodah in which we practice it, right? We bring it into the world. And Gemilut Hasadim is as a character aspect, a personal aspect to it. But also it seems like you're saying like a purpose of it, right? The point of it is to lead to the good, right? Towards becoming good. Okay, great.
Chesed is like the bottom line.
Okay, all right, so it's last on purpose, the bottom line.
Yeah.
Okay, great comment, Lauren. Any other ideas? There's no one right idea. There are many right ideas. All right, we can let it simmer for a little bit. Now we're going to see an alternative theory, but we're going to leave it behind quickly. So here's Shimon ben Gamliel, another early rabbi, but later than Shimon HaTzadik. Each of the first 2 chapters starts with early rabbis and then moves down like a chain of transmission till we get to a later rabbi. Right? Shimon HaTzadik teaches his disciple, who teaches his disciple, da-da-da-da-da, until we get down to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. This is actually the last Mishnah of the first parak. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omeid. He says, same introductory line. The world stands on 3 things. Al Hadin, V'al Ha'emet, V'al Ha'Shalom. On justice, on truth, and on peace. And he has a quote. He quotes from Zechariah, one of the last prophets. He says, Emet u'mishpat, Shalom shiftu b'sh'arechem. Adjudicate judgment of truth and manifest peace within your gates. Okay, so it's uncommon actually, because you don't usually see a verse citation in Pirkei Avot. Usually it's more aphoristic statements. But here it's more midrashic because he's drawing it by reading it out of a verse. He says the world stands on 3 things: justice, truth, and peace. How do you see this vis-a-vis the previous teaching? Any just immediate reflections or reactions?
They temper each other.
Okay, say more.
So you you may have absolute truth, but it won't bring justice and not peace. And you may have justice, which may not totally be the truth, but you need it for peace. So the 3 are intertwined, but they temper each other.
Okay, very interesting. So all 3 are needed, all 3 are related, and each one involves the other. I wonder if maybe we could even say the same thing about the first teaching we saw, that Torah needs Avodah, and Avodah needs Gemilut Hasadim, and Gemilut Hasadim needs Torah, right? You need the principles of Torah, or else you're missing your orientation. But mere theory alone cannot exist in the world. It needs to manifest in practice. That's Avodah. But it can't just be the mindless or heartless execution of rules, just like observing Torah like a halacha robot. Rather, it is towards the end of the good. That it also tempered is a nice word. It must be tempered with love, with kindness, with empathy. There's a way, a kind of a certain kind of a halachic ideology, sensibility that's become very popular nowadays of like kind of this halacha robot. I'm just calling balls and strikes here. But Mishnah, Shimon HaTzadik seems to be pushing against that and saying you can't have Torah without Avodah, without what it means to practice it, and you can't practice it if you're just doing it as if we're all just, neutral monads, bumping against each other. Rather, we're all related to each other. We all owe things to each other. We all must think of the other. We're going to explore this deeper. Again, this is just, just throwing it out there. We're just seeing what sticks. No wrong answers, at least yet. So let's get into each of these elements. So we're going to focus on the first Mishnah first, and then we'll get back to the second one. Okay? Great. So here is a very famous teaching from Breshit Rabbah. Breshit Rabbah is an Amoraic midrash on Breshit, right, on the book of Genesis. It's literally the beginning of Breshit Rabbah. It's very, and it's beginning on purpose. It's a bold teaching. It's very famous. So Rabbi Hoshaya Rabbah Patach. So the great Hoshaya Rabbi, he opens and says, Ve'hiyeh etzlo Amon, ve'hiyesh ashuim yom yom. Well, Bible doesn't always rhyme, but it's nice when it has a nice slant rhyme there. I will be by him as an Amon. An Amon, I mean, we're going to leave that untranslated because the Midrash is going to try to explain what Amon means. But you should have in your head echoes of the word omanut, right? And anyone who's been to Jewish day camp, what is omanut? Arts and crafts, right? So some kind of artisan, some kind of skilled crafts person, right? That's the word. Same word actually as amen, right? Or emunah. It's all from the same root because an amon is an expert in their field, and emunah doesn't just mean like belief in an idea. It means to have faith in someone, right? You trust an expert that you trust the plumber you hire not to ruin your toilet, right? Because they have, they went to plumber school or whatever. They apprenticed with a master plumber. Similarly, you have faith in someone, you have faith in God because they are trustworthy, because God is faithful to you, reliable. So I will be by God an Amon, and I will be a delight every day. Now, this is from Proverbs chapter 8, which the speaker is chokhmah, wisdom. All right? It's like what's called in fancy academies a hypostasis, which means a personification of an idea. So wisdom, Sophia, is saying, I was with God from the very outset. I was an Amon with God. I was a delight, like I was God's friend. I was God's best friend. We were always like playing together. I was God's favorite. I was God's BFF, right? I was God's bestie. But rabbis, I think we can make the easy link here, translate chokhmah, right, in the Bible to mean what? What's our wisdom? Torah, right? Whenever it says chokhmah, it means that the Torah. So what's the claim here? The claim here is that before the world was created, who was God's best friend? Torah, which means that Torah is before the creation of the world. Oh-ho! So we're going to get to a literalization of this. When it says the world stands on three things, it means literally, says the rabbis, that Torah is a foundation of the world. Torah is before the world was built. Torah is what the world stands on, because first God, then Torah, then world. And what is this Torah? It's like a matrix. It's like a blueprint. Okay, we're going to look at this. Amon means artisan, right? Uman, ha-Torah omeret ani hayiti kli umnuto shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Torah says, I was God's, like, handcraft tool. I was God's, like, clamp. I was God's level. I was God's, masonry saw. I was God's lathe. Benoeg sheba'olam. And the way the world works, imagine you contracted contractors, right, to build a house, right? Melech basar vadam boneh palatin. When a flesh and blood king builds a palace, eino boneh ota midat atzmo, ela midat uman. Or you don't even think of a king. You are building a house. You're contracting contract. You don't just, I'm going to, build it myself. No, what do? You consult an architect. You consult a contractor. You hire experts, right? People who know what they're doing. You don't just do it on your own. Ela midat uman. You consult with an expert. V'ha'uman eino boneh ota midat atzmo. And the artisan, the contractor, doesn't build it by their own imaginings either. Ela de ptaraot upinkasaot yeshlo. But the architect also has books, has plans, right? They have to go to the Hall of Records to make sure they're not going to, dig into a gas line or something like that, right? They have their textbooks, which make sure that that the building is going to be sound, right? That the foundation will be sustained, right? I mean, Renee, I'm sure you can relate to this as somebody who just recently completed a big building job, right? Before you start building, the wise craftsperson plans. You know what they say, right? Measure twice, cut once, right? So Torah is God's pre-planning and God's quote-unquote consultant, right? That we have this personification of Torah as God's contractor, God's architect, God, but also at the same time the plans, the matrix, right? The blueprints that you need, the calculations and the like. Ladat heyachu oseh chadarim, so that you know how you build the rooms. Heyachu oseh pishpishin, so you know how you build the what's it called, the doorways and the hallways and the foyers. Kach haya HaKadosh Baruch Hu mabit b'Torah uvarei et ha'olam. What a beautiful image. Accordingly, did God, as it were, peer into the Torah and create the world. So what is the Torah then, according to this midrash? Torah is this pre-created plan. It is blueprint for how the world is supposed to be. It's the matrix that lies under the world. VaTorah amra bereshit bara Elokim ein reshit ela Torah. It's so fun, right? Bereshit bara Elokim. How do you generally translate that, famous 3-word phrase? How do we translate it?
In the beginning, created Hashem. Hashem created.
Good. Bereshit bara Elokim. Right. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Great. That is absolutely correct. That is the normal way you translate it. But the rabbis love picking things apart, and they love bringing your attention to words in totally new and exciting ways. Bereshit means with Reshit, and Reshit means the beginning. So God created the world with Reshit. Ein Reshit ela Torah. And what is the beginning but Torah? Torah is the beginning. With the beginning, God created the world. With the beginning, that is Torah. God created the world. So, another metaphor that doesn't use here, but it says elsewhere that, before you build the palace, first you must build the foundations, right? You don't build a palace, you don't build the top floor of a house before you've built the basement, right? Before you've built the ground floor. Otherwise, kaboom. Disaster. Terrible situation. Torah is, that's like a very concrete metaphor. Torah is foundational to the world. It is the first step so that you can have a universe. It's the basis that the universe is based on. And here it's a little bit more, let's say, conceptual. That Torah are the pre-plans, right? God's intention in making the world. God's ideas about creating the world. God's purpose in creating the world. This completely reframes what it means to learn Torah. How so? How does this change what it means to learn Torah to you? Does this impact what does it mean to develop that relationship with Torah?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Regarding that. So is that saying like Torah is so foundational that you learn it no matter what, because it's like that's what foundational means? Or is it saying like you need other foundations to learn Torah, like has a prerequisite?
Okay, very good. So we have here this metaphor, right, of Torah as the plans that are consulted so that the building can be made, right? Now, if you want to live in a house, would you just read plans all day?
Just read the plans, no.
No, right? So it seems that foundation here is necessary, but not sufficient. The only thing you're going to do is just dream of the house and plan the house. That's not living in a house. Right? You can put your money down, you can draw up the blueprints, but a house isn't built until it's built. So the Torah is foundational in the sense that it is, the plans that are the basis of the building of the house, but it's not the same thing as the house. Right? The house needs the plans, but the plans are not the same thing as the house. What's interesting about this is that Torah, in a way, is like a time jump. It's a time machine of sorts. on one hand, it's saying Torah gives you insight into how it is that the world was created. So it's not just a technical book of rules or something like that, but rather it's giving you insight into what it is and how it is God wanted the world to behave, God wanted the world to come into being. Right? And so by learning Torah, you're then able to track back, through history, through the cosmos, back into Kivyachol, right, the mind of God, the intentions of God, God's plans. It's a very expansive, cosmic, maybe even metaphysical, this notion of the pre-created Torah. That Torah is a portal of sorts, right? Time warp. That actually brings us from creation to before creation. It's very poetic. And I wonder, though, in a way, it can also then impact and alter how we learn Torah today. Torah is on one hand practical, right? We learn it so that we know what God requires of us, what God needs of us, what God wants of us. But also, the other word for uman, like we said before, is companion, like your faithful friend, right? I was with God as God's delight, says wisdom. And also another word for it is, the rabbis say, is pedagogue. And what word does that sound like for all of our educational theorists?
Pedagogy.
That's right, pedagogue, right? But here's a really interesting point. Pedagogy nowadays means like theory of education, right? Thinking through how we make sure that people can learn, right? Pedagogy is, in that way, kind of like the plans, the intentions to make sure that learning can occur, right? You don't just enter a classroom cold. You have to think like, okay, here it is that this stage of development, how young minds work. Or, different modes of learning, right? Some people are more kinetic, they like to move their bodies more, and that's how they learn. Other people are more theoretical, etc. But again, I love going back into the origins of words. So this is clearly a borrowed word from Greek, right? Pedagogue doesn't mean teacher. It actually means escort. I don't mean that in the way we use that today. But escort in the sense of like a babysitter. Like this was the person who brought the child to the school. So it's like a body man of sorts. But what's a pedagogue? A pedagogue is an escort of learning, a companion of learning, someone who helps you walk the path of what it means to get to learning. So Torah is not just some theoretical matrix that we're mystically peering into. Torah is a companion in our learning. Torah learns with us. We learn with Torah. Okay. So that is, part of all of these teachings. I always want them to be portals of sorts, to see the ways in which rabbis think, right? That every teaching itself is, spider webbing out, networking out to all these different things to have in the back of your mind. So when Shimon Tzaddik is saying ala Torah ve'al Avodah ve'al Gemilus Hasadim, it's not just a simple thing. He's thinking about it with all of these associations, and that's what I want us to have with him too. All right, so that was this kind of cosmic image of the Torah, right, as God's pre-creative partner. Here comes the Rambam, who reads it in a way that makes sense to him. Rambam, famously, the great eagle, famously a doctor, every Jewish mother's treat, and also a philosopher, every Jewish mother's nightmare. Rambam is, one of the greatest intellectuals of our tradition, and he sees Torah as an aspect of that kind of path of philosophy. So here's what he says. He says, Yomar shebechochma, right, going back to the original context of the Proverbs verse that we just saw. V'hi haTorah, right, wisdom is Torah. Uvma'alot hamidot, but not just theory, but also ma'alot hamidot, good traits, good qualities, and what it means to ascend in them, what it means to become refined in them. V'hem Gemilut Hasadim. So we're already gesturing towards how these work together. So wisdom is not just the theory of Torah, but it's also the way in which that helps ennoble you as you learn it. I think anyone who has read a book that's really meant something to them leaves that book changed by it, right? There's a time before you read that book, and then there's the you are after you read that book. Studying Torah is a constant reiteration of that transformative process. We become ourselves through learning Torah. We become ennobled. We become better by absorbing the wisdom of Torah. Uvshmirat mitzvot, and keeping the mitzvot. HaTorah he makorbanot, and these are, what are they? They're the offerings, right? The sacrifices in the time of the Torah, in the time of the Bible. Tia hatmadat tikkun ha'olam. Right? Through these three aspects, there is the continuous refinement of the world. V'sidur mitziuto al derech hashalem, and keeping it in good order, in the most complete and perfect way. So Rambam is already gesturing towards a certain kind of synthesis of these three. And he says that, here's one aspect I want us to get to, is that Torah, for him, even though, as a philosopher, you could imagine Rambam in the ivory tower contemplating the wisdom of God, going all the way back, right, to pre-creative times, looking at the hidden pattern of the universe. But then we forget, Rambam wasn't just a philosopher, he was a doctor. And what does a doctor do? A doctor uses their learning, uses their understanding, and is able to,
To heal.
To heal, exactly, which means attending to the specific situation before them. So it's not just that you are, you could imagine, like the philosopher, the point of learning wisdom is to become perfected, right? Imagine like the Greek model. I learn wisdom so that I become perfect. I'm able to, follow the chain of causation and contemplate the pure forms, right? Like in Plato. But Rambam says, no, we're not like escaping to some kind of nirvana. The point of being transformed by Torah is so that then you can help transform the world. We don't just get an escape clause. We don't take the escape hatch out of the world into enlightenment. Rather, once you become enlightened, you realize what there is to do. You realize better what else there is for you to do. The intellectual grows and changes so that they can then better respond to the world and bring healing to the world. So exactly to your point, Terry, that the perfection of self is not, if it's just about the self, that's not Torah, that's egoism. But rather, the perfection of the self is then helped to bring the perfection of the world. And here we see, I think that's in a way a manifesting, a materializing of this notion that there's this marriage between Torah and world. They can't be separated. The Midrash says Torah is the underlying pattern, the matrix, the mother of the world. And every mother takes care of their child, wants them to grow and to be well. Similarly, as we learn Torah, we become a partner in Torah. We too then assume that responsibility. Okay. Thoughts, reflections, reactions, outrage?
Am I misunderstanding you? That you're saying that Torah existed before God? That God did not create Torah, that in fact Torah was there before God created the world.
Yes, Torah is before world, but not before God.
So God exists and creates Torah, then creates the world? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's the order. God first makes a friend. There's a famous midrash in Pirkei to Rebbe Eliezer, which is like an 8th century midrash, in which says, first, before the world, all there was God and God's name alone. And God's name is also seen as kind of maybe a gesture towards Torah. So first, God is alone. And God, though, wants there to be a world. But in order for there to be a world, God must first consult the contractor. So God makes a Torah so that God has a plan to make the world.
So God is the architect as well as the builder.
But okay, here's the thing, Jack. I love and I hate you for this. You are very right in noticing this is something that Professor of Midrash David Stern points out in his book Parables in Midrash, which is a great book if you want to track it down. He says there's actually always a disjuncture. There's always a little breakdown between what's called the mushal and the nimshal, between the metaphor and how it's spelled out. So in the metaphor, right, it sure seems like the Torah is both architect and contractor and blueprint and textbook. But then with the nimshal, how it's spelled out, it does seem like, oh, God's the architect and Torah's the blueprint, and that's it. But so you're right in noticing there's a little bit of a distance between the two. What Stern suggests, and I think this is actually really true about Midrash, it's playful. Right? Midrash is actually giving you tools to use, to play around with in terms of imagining what Torah is and what Torah means. In a way, it doesn't require you to literalize it, but rather it's giving you a way to stage it in your mind. Because it's beyond what we can understand. It's giving us a story that can hopefully communicate something, gesture towards something for us. Shosh asks, if Torah is before the world, then why would it not belong to everyone? Well, this is the difference in a way between Torah and Chokhmah. Chokhmah, wisdom, does belong to everybody. And indeed, there's a lot of rabbinic teachings about how every community in the world, every religion, every group, every society has wisdom. There's lots of different texts and cultural artifacts and the like that I've been very inspired by. But there's a qualitative difference between wisdom and Torah. There's something more that Torah offers, and if only just because something that belongs to us, something that reflects this beautiful singular relationship between the Jewish people and God, right, mediated by Torah. Something that's intimate, and that's something that you only get through that kind of close relationship. Okay. Let's move on to Avot de Rebbe Natan. Is an early post-Mishnaic text. It's not Talmud quite. It's called one of the Masechtot Ketanot, the tiny tractates, as I like to translate that, which are these later kind of miscellaneous tractates that are usually included at the end of Seder Nezikin. It is a quasi-Gemara on Pirkei Avot. Okay, so it's a later rabbinic take on this foundational ethical text. So it is now responding to this teaching. Al HaTorah, new, right? That's how you can translate that. New, Al HaTorah, what does that mean? How is the world based on Torah? Because it says, Chesed chafatzti velo zavach, God says, quote, Hosea quotes God saying, I want love, I want kindness, not sacrifice. Vidat Elokim me olot. And I want the knowledge of God, right? Enlightenment, more than I want burnt offerings. So it's a very interesting, right? This is a prophet still in the time of the temple, time of the first temple, who is saying, in a way, temple is essential, yes, but it is not all-encompassing. God wants what the sacrifices bring, not just sacrifices themselves. You can also think of the famous Haftorah from Yom Kippur, in which God says, yeah, you're great about keeping Shabbos and you're great about bringing sacrifices, but you leave the poor to die, starving and naked in the streets. That's the sacrifice that I want, says God. All right, so the sacrifice is all, like we were saying before, sacrifices, Avodah, like Torah, need to eventuate in Gemilut Hasadim, in loving, kind, acting in the world. All right, so Mikan, right, you might think, right, you might think that the burnt offering, right, the Olah offering, which is the most holy offering. Why? Because it's entirely consumed by fire. There's three kinds of offerings. There's Olah, there's Mincha, and there's Zevach Shlamim. Olah is the Mincha goes to God, goes to the priests. Zevach Shlamim goes to God, goes to the priests, and goes to you. You get to chow down a little bit on the sacrifice too. Olah only goes to God. It's fully consumed. Okay? So you might think that the Olah is the greatest offering that we can ever offer God, that there's nothing that beats the Olah. There's no trump card in the great bridge of the Avodah game that can ever trump Olah. But no, because whenever you see Mikan, or whenever you see the word Yachol in the Midrash, it's always going to set you up for something else. But no. Why? V'talmud Torah chaviva lifnei hamakom. No, learning Torah is more dear to God than even the most refined, holy, sacrificial offering. She'im adam lamad Torah yodea da'ato shel makom, like we said before in the Midrash, because if somebody learns Torah, they gain knowledge of God's das, right? God's consciousness, God's intention, God's knowledge. Now, everything we say in this, there usually comes with a kivyachol, right? Like, human minds can't comprehend the magnitude of God's consciousness. But we are imbued with it, right? By learning Torah, we do partake of God's consciousness. Then you will understand the fear of God, i.e. piety, and you will find knowledge of God, or God's consciousness. Now, we said before that up there it was translated Gemilut Hasadim as acts of piety, and I think this is really interesting kind of play here, because the thrust of this teaching is you might think to be a frum yid, right, to be a good Jew, what do? You have to give the best sacrifices. And you have to give the holiest sacrifices. This strictly Jewish thing, temple service. But no, Torah, and maybe to Shosha's point, is more democratic than that. Because Torah is available no matter where you are, no matter when you are. And Torah gives you insight into the kernel, right? What it's really supposed to be getting at. I think there's another aspect I want to get at soon, but I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I don't want to put the cart before the horse. Mikan lechacham, right? And from this we infer that a chacham, right, a rabbi, a sage, someone learning Torah, Talmid Chacham, right, who sits and darshans, right, expounds on the Torah in a community, that God considers that person, the Torah considers that person as if that sage, that student of Torah, right, that person who went to seminary, that person who went to yeshiva, that person who read the book in their own time, that person who devotes themselves to Torah, whoever they are, that's as if they have offered the best, fattiest fats and blood on the altar. That Torah displaces sacrificial worship. That learning Torah is in place as if you are here's the interesting point, right? Who offers the olah? Who offers the burnt offering?
The Kohen.
The Kohen. Who learns Torah?
I'm not sure it's the Kohen.
It's any Jew.
Right.
Any Jew can learn Torah. Hence, this is democratizing in its way. Right? The Kohen, it's a professional caste of priests. A bloodline determines that they have access to the sacred service. Learning Torah, at least today, what it requires is time, dedication, support, sure, but any Jew can do it.
Then what is the purpose of the sacrifice?
That is a large question that I am a defender of sacrifices in their context, but in a post-temple world, what are the rabbis trying to do? The rabbis are trying to translate, right, the meaning of the sacrificial system, which is no longer accessible to us, right, because the temple is, nebuch, it's destroyed. The sacrifices are gone. We can't offer them anymore. Right? Only in the temple, only on Har Zion. Right? We're not allowed to have our little individual altars.
So what was
So
the
then what
purpose
takes
of
the
it?
place of the temple? Jack, what takes the place of the temple?
Yeah, what was the purpose of it then?
That's a larger question. I'll gesture to, everything has its place in its time, right? That the temple was what was needed at that time, but the rabbis see it as valuable, agree, we miss it, but not complete because we have a life after Torah. We have a life after the temple. And what takes the place of the temple? Torah. Right, the learning Torah takes place of what the temple used to offer. Yeah, Renee.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering the same thing as Jack is, that, we're really studying here the three pillars that the world stands on. So Torah, Avodah, and Chesed, right? So we're missing Avodah. We don't have a temple anymore.
Right.
So we're missing one of the pillars. Like, we're missing one of the three pillars. So are you getting to
Or
that?
are we?
Like, jump the gun.
No,
Well,
right.
this seems like, they're compensating
Yeah.
for us missing that second pillar.
Beautiful. Okay, so I didn't include the teaching that says Avodah, Ketzad, right? And then it says, when we had the temple, the rains were flowing and the blessing flowed, and now that we don't have a temple, everything's terrible and ruined. I didn't include that. Every source sheet is a curation. But I want to make a claim. I mean, one thing we do is that we do stage the temple in our minds. When we say korbanos in the morning when we daven, or when we read about the temple service every morning, in a traditional prayer book, in a way, like, we use our words, we use our learning to stage the temple as if it's, in our imagination, and that's kind of taking its place. But I want to make a different claim about what avoda means. Remember, avoda refers to the temple service, that's true, but it also means labor, it means work, it means service. Right? And I want to see how the rabbis get at that. So, interesting, again, it's who's the one who is considered as if they've offered fat and blood on the altar?
The Kohen.
No, that's the person who literally offered the fat and blood on the altar. Who is considered as if they offered fat and blood on the altar?
The person who's offering the sacrifice.
No, that's
The one who brings
literally offering the sacrifice. Who is considered as if they offered the
The
sacrifice?
people who study Torah.
Gewalt, good. The Talmid Chacham who's learning Torah. But learning Torah, Susie, or what?
Oh, like following?
Yes-ish, we're going to get there. But first, studying and?
Like enacting. Like,
Let's go back to the words. Chacham sheyoshev v'doresh b'kahal. A Talmid Chacham
understand.
who sits, learns, and darshans, expounds on, teaches.
Oh, teach it. Okay.
Okay? So who is the one who is in place of the Kohen now? Not somebody, and this back to Rambam's point, not somebody who just gobbles up Torah and becomes super Torah genius, but rather somebody who is learning Torah to then communicate it and bring it to the people. That's who's like a Kohen, Lauren. Why? Because the Kohen was, even though they're in their ivory tower of the temple, their purpose is to serve as a conduit between God and us, to offer the sacrifices to make sure that whatever they were supposed to do flowed back to us. Torah learning is not just an escape hatch to learn about the mind of God, but rather it too is about communication and relation. It's not just somebody who just learns Torah and steigs a gemurah all day. It's somebody who learns Torah so they can bring it to the people. Okay,
So anybody who teaches Limudei Kodesh is mamash taking the place of a Kohen.
Right, you're not no Gavavar about that, right, Lauren?
No, I'm not going to give it to her. That's what my dad did.
No, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, no, I know you're thinking of your father, right, who was a very, very respected and valued teacher of Torah, very much, right? So Torah is not just about absorbing or learning; it's about bringing it to the people, and that's how you're like a Kohen. So that's the first aspect, Renee, I think, of the subtle avoda displacement or replacement, right? How is avoda? First we have Torah, then avoda. So the first avoda is teaching. Teaching as an act of holy service. A teacher as a servant of God, right? A teacher as a servant of the people. Connecting the people and the Torah. Okay, but how else service too? So then we get to practice, Lauren, okay? So you're totally right to intuit that. I just want to take it in order. And then it says this. Shnei Talmidei Chachamim sheyoshvim ve'oskim b'Torah. Two, students of Torah who are learning Torah together, and then chavrusa, okay? And then v'avra lifneim kala omita, and then a bride or a casket, like a coffin, passed before them. Now, why those two things? Because they both involve parades, right? There's the bridal procession, the wedding procession, as they're on their way to the chuppah, and there's the levayas mace, right? There's the escorting of the funeral bier on the way to the Beis Olam, right? To the cemetery. Im biyadan kidei tzorkan al yivatlu mimishnatan. If the processions have everything they need, everyone they need, then you can keep on learning. But im lav, if they still need someone, if they still need something, then ya'amdu v'yishnu v'kalsu lechala v'yilvu lames. What do? Then you fancy rabbis, you students of Torah, you yeshiva bachers, if they need you, it's not enough to say, it's not okay to say, we're learning Torah, we're busy. Rather, if you are really learning Torah, you know that in what's called bitulo zehu kiyumo, to nullify it is to keep it. How? You need to stop learning, you need to, cease, you get up, you stop learning, and you go dance in front of the bride, or you go and comfort and escort the dead. That's what it means to be learning Torah. What does it mean? Avodah. Torah needs to eventuate in its practice. All right, so we have two aspects of practice here. One is that Torah can't just be theory, it needs to be taught to people. That's its eventuation. And secondly, Torah is not just theoretical, it needs to be realized in the real world through its keeping. And also, back to Terry's point from before about healing, attending to what people need from you and how that then tailors your behavior, right? Determines your behavior. So that was a great pushback, Renee, in terms of like what happened to the Avodah. Is it just locked in the past? It's subtle, but I think here it is, right? The rabbis are giving us ways to realize, manifest, concretize Torah in the world and what God needs of us and wants of us in the world. And then the further manifestation of that, realization of that, is exactly as Lauren said in the beginning of this whole class, that the telos, right, the tachlis, is not just what God needs of us, but like we just gestured at before, what others need from us. Right? Acts of kindness. So al gemilus Hasadim ketzad, acts of loving kindness. New, as it says, same pasuk it quotes, which means, again, these are all connected. Ki chesed chavatzti v'lo zavach. I want love, not lambs. Right? I want kindness, not sacrifice. Ha'olam mitchila lo nivra ela b'chesed. In the beginning, the world was created only with love. As it says, Ki amarti olam chesed yibaneh. The world will be built with love. Shamayim tachin emunascha bahem. The heavens are installed with your faithfulness. You installed the heavens with your faithfulness, right? With your being there, present with us. We say of God. Pamachas. And this is, I think you'll find this quite interesting right now. Haya Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai yotzei miYerushalayim. So, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai escaped Jerusalem right on the heels of the villain Titan, Hadrianus's destruction of the temple. Right, he escapes, and Rabbi Yehoshua follows after him. He escapes too, and they witness the smoking, burning embers of the temple razed to the ground. Negavot. Rabbi Yehoshua says, Oy lanu. I don't need to translate that. Oy! That the temple is destroyed. the place that atoned for the sins of Israel. Exactly the question you were asking. What do we do? The temple's gone. Something's broken. Something's missing, right? All these sacrifices that helped get us clean, they helped get us right with God, and now we're just doomed? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says back to him, my son, don't be aggrieved. Al yirolecha. We have a different kapara. We have a different atonement that is equivalent to the temple. What is it? Gemilus Hasadim. To love, to act lovingly towards others. To do loving acts towards others. That is equivalent to the temple sacrifice. Again, back to the point. Temple sacrifice, a service provided by a caste of experts, the Kohanim, only the priests. But who is able to be kind to your neighbor? Anyone. Anybody can now effect the power that the temple had by being attentive and kind to others. How do we know this? Well, here's a pasuk. Chesed chafatzti v'lo zavach. God said through the mouth of Hosea, I want love, not sacrifice. I mean, God, in God's wisdom, had the seed of how to survive the destruction. Because the key of the temple was that it was a place of love. It was where we were forgiven. It was where we were able to reconnect with God. But the love, just because the temple is gone, doesn't mean the love is gone. Now we just have the love. Right? The temple is a house of love, and now the house is gone, but what's under the house? The foundation of Torah. The Avodah, the practice of what it means to build again. And Gemilus Hasadim, what it means to attend to and take care of others. To make sure your house is open on all sides, like the chuppah, to make sure anyone who needs can come. What are these examples of the, it quotes Daniel as a great lover of people, as a great kind person, the Daniel from the Bible. What were these Gemilus Chasadim who do? We know he wasn't offering sacrifices. It can't be piety. It needs to be kindness. Why? Because he was in Babylonia after the destruction of the temple. You can't offer sacrifices in Babylonia. So it's clear, what was he doing? What were the holy acts he was doing? He was mitakenet hakala. He was making sure that brides had everything they need to feel beautiful, to feel good on their wedding day. And he would misamacha, and he would make sure that they were happy. He would provide for them joy. He would escort the dead, like we saw before. He would make sure that the dead got to where they needed to go to have their eternal rest. He would give money to the poor. And when he davened, his prayers were received with God's favor. God responds with love to those who provide love for others. The prayers can only be included in this list because Daniel, as a holistic person, knew that there's no difference, in a way. That if you're going to say you're a lover of God, you need to also be a lover of other human beings. You can't have one without the other. And to love another human being is also, who's created in the image of God, is also to love God. So we see how these two, I think what a lot of us were intuiting before, these three are working together, in a way they're working sequentially. Torah is about trying to make sure that our minds are focused on ways to become more refined, ways to partake of God's mind, of God's intention. But that's not an escape into the nirvana of Gan Eden, but rather it provides guidance so that we can bring that into the world, keep mitzvot, right? Honor our commitments to God. But not just that, as Yachin says, but also then to make sure that we are attending to others' needs from us as well. That's what it means to become a fully complete person. These are the three things we need. We need to perfect our minds, perfect our bodies, to provide that service, and to perfect our hearts, so that we are always making sure to be open to those who need. Can't have one without the other. Yeah, please. Oh, no, it's okay. I've been using the Rav, Joseph Soloveitchik's essays on Pirkei Avot. There's a really great one on this Mishnah called "The World Rests Upon Three Things." I wanted to share a quick reflection from him, and then we'll close by looking at this other Mishnah and seeing how it relates. So Shimon HaTzadik considered the mere cognitive gesture of studying the Torah a great ethical performance. I always need to translate his incredible language into, English. Shimon HaTzadik saw the intellectual exercise of studying Torah as not just being neutral, but itself leading to goodness. Right? To learn Torah is itself an ethical act. How? The dedication to an intellectual Torah life is eo ipso, a commitment to an ethical life. To learn Torah means that you are committing yourself to the good. Torah needs to result in goodness. Otherwise, it would be meaningless to say it comes from God. However, pure knowledge is not sufficient, as we, I think, have seen from all of these teachings. Torah is not just theoretical. It's not just knowledge. It's not just self-perfection, but rather it's what it means to manifest. The idea must find its consummation in basic realities. We find the principle in Torah so that we can bring it to people. The word must turn into deed. Right? The words we learn in Torah must be practiced and brought into the world. The abstraction becomes concrete. In short, Torah consists of both idea and reality, matrix, right, and world, ideal and realization. Right? The ideal of Torah brought into the world, made manifest, either in our actions towards God, Avodah, mitzvot, or our actions towards others, Gemilut, Hasadim. Okay. Pause. Breathe. Halfway there. No, just kidding. We're most of the way there. The other one, we're not going to do as much with. Okay. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, 3 things the world stands on. Justice, truth, and peace. Now, we saw Torah as ethics before. Torah in becoming interpersonal or religious practice. But here, Rambam says it's not just ethics, which is about how we behave towards other entities, right? How we behave towards other people, or how you even behave with God. But he says here enters the politic, right? Political life. Now, political life, not in terms of like running a slime campaign on somebody, chas v'shalom, or all this election that's happening soon. But the point of politics, right, is not parties or whatever, but it's about how to create a society based in principles, how to create a society based in what is right and good. So it's not just the individuals, how they interact with each other, but rather how you create a world, a city, a community that hews to these values, that highs to these values. Okay, so he says, Hadin, what is deen? What is justice or judgment? Hanhagat hamidina beyosher. It is running or administering a medina, which means a political body, right? Medina can mean a country, a nation. It can, but in Arabic it means a city, and in Aramaic too it means a city, right? Some kind of social body, political body, biyosher, with uprightness, right? That no corruption, to make sure it's run well. What does it mean to have a society that reflects our values? The great, lamentably late teacher Abraham Joshua Heschel said, if you want to know the value of society, you look to the child and you look to the elderly. How do you know if a society is healthy and good and right? If they take care of the young and they take care of the old, i.e., what are the young and the old? Those who are not contributing to society economically anymore, right? They're not pay in, pay out. They're not workers. Rather, we take care of them because it's the right thing to do, because they deserve it, because every human being does. It says, so what's peace? What's truth? Hama'alot hasichliot v'hashalom. Hama'alot hasichliot. Truth is attaining intellectual advancement, like we saw before. That's kind of related to Torah. And shalom, what's peace? Ma'alot hamidot, making sure that your character is up to snuff. Uchsheyimtza elu hashlosha yeh hametziut b'shleimut she'efshar lo b'lo safek. Then you'll see that you will have, again, a holistic, a completed existence without any ambiguity or ambivalence. Okay. We can see these as mapping to the prior triad, too. We see that the intellectual element of truth, can we relate that to Torah? The character element of peace, which we can relate to Gemilut Hasadim, acts of loving kindness. And very interestingly, deen, worship, holy service is politics. Why? Because it is the manifestation of our values in the world. Politics is, or should be, holy work. It is where we are able to achieve God's will of making sure that the orphan is not starving, that the poor have what they need, that the homeless are taken care of. Right? Politics is where we're able to achieve things on a scale that just individuals alone cannot. Another companion of mine in preparing these classes is a compiled commentary of the Gra, the genius of Vilna, the Gaon of Vilna. And this is a comment from one of his other books, but it's quoted in a collection of his teachings about Pirkei Avot. It says this: the rabbis say in Maseches Shabbos that any judge who adjudicates truthfully, it's as if they've become a partner in the creation of the world. We bring all the way back to the Midrash that we saw, that to engage with Torah in some way brings you all the way back to that moment when nothing became something, when the world became. So you can understand this. What does it mean to be a partner, a shaytef, right? To be in God's LLP, right, of World Incorporated. What does it mean to be a partner with God? Not just associate anymore, you're a partner. What does it mean? There's two aspects, he says. One is, what does a judge need if you're sitting on a base team, if you're a justice? You need to know the law, right? You need to be an expert in the law. You need to actually know what you're talking about. You need to study the books. You need to know your constitution, know the law books. You need to know your halacha, Shulchan Aruch, etc. But it's not just theory. It's also chush. How would you translate chush, Lauren?
Wisdom?
Yeah, but like gut wisdom, right? It's like intuition.
Okay,
You know
yeah.
what I mean? It's not book smarts, it's street smarts. Or you have to know how to be discerning in the world. He says, even besides knowing all of this, fancy pants halacha, a chacham needs to understand who they're dealing with. Who has to have a good sense of who's being honest with me and who's trying to give me the runaround. Or you have to be a good student of character. Because without that, without knowing this thing thoroughly, then, and here's something very, very important. Someone dishonest can take advantage of the system and use the loopholes and the trickery to win. I think we've all seen worthy and righteous systems perverted by people who are able to make them work for them rather than realize that they're supposed to transform us. So a judge who is working well is not just somebody who knows the books, but according to the Gra, and this is what it means to have these three things together, Din, Emes, and Shalom, is that you also need to know people. You need to know people so you know when somebody is trying to turn Torah into just a system of rules and forget that it's a system of wisdom. And wisdom is about the world. It's about manifesting something better than what you left with before. And he says, ideally, if you're able to adjudicate truthfully, then even the liar who tried to trick you will leave and say, you know what? I deserved that. I deserve this. I need this accountability. Back to the point, this is Avodah. This is like the temple in the sense that this is the way in which people can have accountability with each other, to work through tension, to work through harm that was done one to another, and a way to get right, a way to make up for it. That's what justice is supposed to do. Justice is supposed to attend to the truth so that there can be peace. Only by being able to pair theory and practice, knowledge of Torah with intuition about people, and then the wisdom of how to bring those two things together and to have a pro-social, right, a result that leads to more togetherness, more harmony, and more peace. You know, the notion, this is a famous line from the current Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court. Sorry to bring my Americanness into this. But he says, you know, I'm just calling balls and strikes, says John Roberts. He sees the law as just book smarts, right? The law is the law. It doesn't have any real connection to the world. But the Gra, I think, is pushing against that. Gesundheit. The Gra is pushing against that. And he's saying it's not just the black letter law. It is about achieving what the law is trying to do, which is to bring people back together, to create a society, a community that's able to work. So I think what we, there's this really beautiful point that we don't need to go through this whole long thing. I'll share the source sheet later if you want to look at it inside yourself. But the Torah quotes Rabbeinu Yonah, who says, you know, these two teachings, why isn't there just one teaching? Why do we have both? He says that the first one, Torah, Avodah, Gemilut, Hasadim, these are the three things the world is based on. It's the three things that the world was created for. All right? So the world exists so that we can become better intellectually, learning Torah, so that we can serve God, do the Avodah, and so that we can be kind to each other. We have a world, we are but players, right? The whole world is a stage, and we are acting the parts that we need to play to create something better than what we had before. A world of Torah, a world of service, and a world of kindness. But how do we have that world? That's what the second three are for.
In my office.
The world would not survive. The world would not survive unless it's able to have justice, unless we're able to have access to truth and be able to create peace. So the purpose of the world are those three things, Torah, Avodah, Gemilut, Hasadim. But the survival of the world, the way the world needs, what the world needs to progress is justice, love, and peace. It's the difference between the tools and the house that gets built. The tools we have are love, justice, and peace, so that the world is able to be, the house of the world is able to stand, to be sustainable. And so that we're able to have the venue we need to pursue our higher calling. And what is that? What is our higher calling? The world is being able to access, partake of God's mind, of God's intentions for us. A world of being able to attend to others, to be kind and loving, to make sure that people have what they need, to be there for people. And last but not least, very much, and I so appreciated that intervention before, a world of service, a world in which we can materialize, realize, and actualize these higher principles of ours, not just as theoretical ideas, but as real behaviors and commitments in this world. Yasher koach to all of you. Thanks so much for joining. This class will continue next week with another kaleidoscopic journey into Pirkei Avot. We have also a Parsha class on Thursday evenings, same Zoom link at 7 p.m. It's a more like informal chat about the Parsha. And we have Shabbos davening. We have davening in person at Beth Lida. If you can join us somewhere between 6:45 and 7 on Friday night and 9:30 on Shabbos morning. And then we have Havdalah Saturday night also on Zoom. Hope to see you at any and all of those. And also, very exciting, we're having our Lag BaOmer bonfire in the backyard. Everyone's welcome. There'll be beer. There'll be hot dogs. There'll be veggie dogs. All kinds of dog. And bring your dog. Nisim, bring your dog. And bring your guitar. Bring a story. I'm actually having a friend of mine who's like a professional storyteller who's going to tell some beautiful tales. It's going to be really like around the fire. It's going to be gavaldic. So I hope you can join. May 18th, Wednesday at 8ish. We'll daven and then we'll make the fire. It'll be a very sweet thing. I hope to see you there. Thanks so much for joining. Have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.